My mother grabbed my arm in the hallway of the Hartley Grand Hotel. The same hotel where, in about 20 minutes, 200 of the most important people in Atlanta's business community were going to sit down for dinner. And she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "I need you to stay quiet tonight, Dana. Don't embarrass us." She said it like she was reminding me to chew with my mouth closed. Like I was 12 years old. Like I hadn't spent the last 4 years of my career making sure that the very event she was about to serve food at stayed alive. I smiled at her. I said, "Of course, Mom," and then I walked back into the banquet hall and waited for the night to happen. It happened. Welcome to Twist of Revenge, where the people who underestimated you always find out why they shouldn't have. My name is Dana Reeves. I'm 32 years old and I work as a senior event manager at Hartley Group, a corporate consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. My job is to plan, manage, and execute every large-scale event the company throws: client dinners, charity galas, product launches, board retreats. Literally everything: the lighting, the floor plan, the food, the timing of the speeches, the way the room feels when someone walks in for the first time. That's my job. For 4 years, I have been the person who makes sure none of it goes wrong. I'm good at that job. I'm very good at it. I'm good at it for the same reason I've always been good at anything that involves paying attention to details that other people overlook. Because I grew up in a family where being overlooked taught me to notice things. That turns out to be useful. But nobody in my family knew exactly how good I was or exactly what I had been doing behind the scenes until a Tuesday evening in October in the ballroom of the Hartley Grand Hotel, which is where this story actually lives. I need to go back a few years to explain what led to that moment. Because the story of what happened at that dinner only makes sense if you understand what was happening before it. I grew up in Roswell, Georgia, about 40 minutes north of Atlanta, in a house that always smelled like food. That's not a complaint, it's actually one of my best memories. Walking in the front door after school and smelling rosemary and garlic and whatever stock was reducing on the back burner. That smell was home. My parents, Tom and Karen Reeves, had owned Reeves Catering since before I was born. My dad built the business from scratch, starting with church functions and neighborhood cookouts, growing it slowly into a real company that could handle weddings, corporate lunches, community events. My mom ran the front-facing side: client meetings, proposals, bookings. My dad handled the kitchen. My older sister Becca handled everything else because that's how it worked in our family. Becca was always the one who handled everything else. I want to tell you about a specific memory, because it explains something about how our family worked that's hard to describe in the abstract. I was about 14. We had a big catering event, a church anniversary dinner, maybe 60 people, and everything that could go wrong was going wrong. A delivery van broke down. 2 of the kitchen assistants called in sick. I spent the entire day running things back and forth from the car to the kitchen, refilling serving dishes, washing and re-racking utensils, doing whatever needed doing. At the end of the night, when the event was done and everyone was exhausted, and my dad was finally sitting down with a glass of water, my mom turned to Becca and said, "We couldn't have done it without you tonight." She said it genuinely, warmly. She meant it. And Becca had worked hard and deserved to hear it. But I had worked just as hard. Nobody said anything to me. Not because they were trying to hurt me. I actually believe that. They just didn't notice. They saw Becca the way you see someone who's always there, someone whose presence is part of the definition of the event. I was just extra help. Helpful, yes, but not essential. Not the one you think of when you're counting who made it work. I remember going home that night and lying in bed and thinking about it, running the math of the day in my head. Hours I worked versus hours Becca worked. Trips I made to the kitchen versus trips Becca made. Dishes I washed. Cases I carried. The math came out about even. But the credit hadn't been distributed that way, and I was old enough to notice that gap without being old enough to know what to do with it. I didn't say anything about it. I wasn't that kind of kid. I was the kind who went quiet when things didn't add up rather than the kind who pushed back. That trait would serve me well later, though not in the ways I expected. I want to be honest about my childhood. Because honesty matters to this story. I wasn't mistreated. I wasn't abused. I had food and shelter and parents who were present. What I had, underneath all of that, was a very specific kind of being overlooked. Becca was the one who stayed close to home. Becca was the one who went to community college in Roswell and came home immediately after. Becca was the one who stepped into the catering business the moment she was old enough to hold a clipboard. And Becca was, in my mother's mind, the daughter who showed up. Which meant I was, by default, the daughter who left. I didn't leave because I didn't love my family. I left because I needed something different. There is a difference between leaving someone and leaving a situation, and that difference matters, even when the people you love can't always see it. I left for the University of Georgia, where I studied hospitality management. My mom packed my car the morning I left for my freshman year. She was practical about it, made sure I had everything on the list, reminded me to call when I arrived, tucked a check inside a card that said, "Be smart and be safe." No big emotional goodbye. That wasn't how she was built. I drove the 4 hours to Athens with the radio loud and the windows down and told myself it was the beginning of something. It was. I got an internship in Atlanta in my junior year, interning at a small event company downtown, and something clicked for me the first week I was there. The organizing, the logistics, the way a room full of strangers could have a good night because someone had thought carefully about every detail in advance. I was good at it. Genuinely good, in the way that comes not just from skill but from caring. I cared whether the events worked, in the same way my dad cared whether the food was right. After graduation, I got a real job at a smaller firm. Then I got promoted. Then I applied to Hartley Group, which was bigger and more demanding and exactly where I needed to be. My mother came to my college graduation. She sat in the bleachers with my dad and Becca and my Aunt Lena, and when she saw me walk across the stage, she stood up and clapped. And afterward at lunch, she told me she was proud of me. She meant it. But she also said, quietly, not cruelly, just like a statement of fact, that she wasn't sure what I was going to do with a hospitality degree when there was a perfectly good family business waiting for me, which kind of took the shine off it. The dynamic had been set a long time ago. Becca was the one who stayed and sacrificed. I was the one who chased something for herself. In my mother's mental accounting, those two things were not equal, and they never would be. Becca showed up. Dana left. End of story. She never once asked herself whether the story might have a different middle. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, is that I never actually left. Let me explain that, because it's the whole thing. It sounds like a dramatic statement, but it's really just a fact about what happens when you care about people and have skills they can use and decide to use those skills without making a big announcement about it. The people you're helping don't always know it's happening. Sometimes that's by accident. In my case, it was by choice. Because I knew my family. I knew exactly how the conversation would go if I announced what I was doing. My mother would have resisted. She would have called it charity. She would have told me they didn't need my help, that the business was fine, that she didn't want favors. And then the arguing would have started, and the whole thing would have become something complicated and charged and difficult, and the actual thing I was trying to accomplish, which was just getting money into the family business without it being a whole conversation, would have gotten buried under the conversation. So I didn't announce it. I just did it. Quietly. For 3 years. And this is what happened when they finally found out. In my first year at Hartley Group, I was barely a coordinator. I was doing logistics, managing vendor contracts, sending reminder emails to caterers who showed up late. I was nobody in the grand scheme of things. But I was watching everything, and I was learning fast. And by the end of year 2, I was running my own events with my own budget and my own vendor list. That felt significant. That felt like something. And one of the first things I did when I had a real budget and a real vendor list was call my dad. Not my mom, my dad. Because I knew my mother would see it as charity. She would say no out of pride. She would turn it into a conversation about whether I thought they couldn't take care of themselves. My dad, on the other hand, would understand immediately what I was actually offering. I called him on a Sunday afternoon in March, about 2.5 years into my job at Hartley. The timing was deliberate. Sunday afternoons were when he was usually in the kitchen puttering, not doing anything urgent, which meant he'd actually talk to me rather than telling me he'd call back. I asked him how business was going. He was honest with me. He said it was okay. A little slow. Nothing to worry about, he said. But I could hear the thing underneath those words that parents say when they don't want their kids to worry. The slight flatness that means actually things are a little tight. I told him I had a corporate lunch coming up, about 60 people, a real contract. I told him Reeves Catering was the right fit. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your mother might not like this." I said, "That's why I'm calling you first." He laughed a little. Then he said he'd talk to her. She agreed with the condition that this was a professional arrangement, not a favor. I understood perfectly. I signed the contract. Reeves Catering showed up. The food was extraordinary. The client was thrilled. The event went off without a hitch. and I stood in the back of that conference room watching my father's cooking feed 60 people who had no idea a family was in that kitchen, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something close to home. After that, I kept hiring them. Carefully. Not every event I wasn't going to make it obvious, because obvious would have been a problem. I hired other vendors too. Because that's how you run events professionally. And because mixing in other vendors kept the pattern from being too clear to anyone who might be looking. But Reeves Catering became one of my reliable go-to vendors, one of the names I went back to again and again because they consistently delivered. They were reliable. They were good. The food was always right, the service staff was always professional, and every contract I signed with them was a little bit of money going back into the family business that my parents had spent their whole lives building. In year 2 of the arrangement, Reeves Catering was able to hire a second full-time kitchen assistant, something my dad had been putting off because the budget wasn't there. He mentioned it to me, casually, over the phone, not realizing I already knew why it was possible now. "Business has been picking up," he said. "We're finally in a good spot." I said, "I'm glad to hear that, Dad. I was glad." More glad than I could explain without also explaining everything else. In year 3, my dad bought a new commercial refrigeration unit. He'd been nursing the old one for 4 years past its expected service life, running it on patches and prayers. The new one cost almost $12,000. He called me from the kitchen the day they installed it. I could hear him running his hand along the shelves, pleased in the specific way men of his generation get pleased about good equipment, and he said, "It's a good one. Should last another 15 years. I said, "That's great, Dad." It was. Throughout all of this, I never told my mother where the work was coming from. My dad figured it out eventually. I'll come back to that, but my mother didn't know. She thought Reeves Catering had simply grown their client base. She thought the new kitchen assistant was the result of good marketing. She thought the refrigeration unit was the fruit of a few years of tight budgeting paying off. She was right about one of those things. The budgeting had paid off. It had just paid off partly because I was sending 6-figure contracts their way every year. The thing about doing something quietly for people is that it doesn't feel heroic or strategic in the moment. It just feels like a decision you make every time it comes up. Should I send this event to a different caterer or to my family? My family delivers. They're professional. There's no conflict of interest I'm not disclosing, so I send it to them. That's it. There's no grand plan. There's just a lot of small decisions made the same way every time that add up over 3 years to something that nobody expected. If you've ever quietly taken care of someone who thought you weren't paying attention, stay with me. Because what happened at that gala is where the quiet part ended. The Hartley Annual Gala was the biggest event on our calendar every year. 200 guests. Top clients. Press. A full sit-down dinner, live music, a formal presentation from our CEO, Paul Hartley. It was the event that set the tone for the entire company's year, the one that clients remembered. The one that either reinforced or undermined everything we spent the rest of the year telling people about who we were. It was also the event I'd spent 4 years watching senior managers plan, learning from each one, noting what worked and what didn't, storing every detail the way you store things when you know that someday the responsibility is going to land on you. This year, for the first time, it did. Paul gave me the lead planner role in July, and I spent 3 months on it. I redesigned the venue layout. I changed the cocktail hour flow to give people more room to actually talk to each other instead of standing in 2 tight clusters near the bars. I worked with the AV team on the presentation setup so the CEO's remarks would feel conversational rather than formal. I rebuilt the dinner timeline from scratch, adding 15 minutes between courses so the service staff wouldn't be rushing and guests wouldn't feel pushed. Small things. Dozens of small things. That's what planning is. It's the accumulation of small decisions that, taken together, determine whether a room full of people has a good night or a great one. I had chosen Reeves Catering to handle the full dinner service. It was the biggest job I had ever sent their way, 190 covers at the dinner service itself, plus cocktail hour past appetizers, plus a dessert station. It was also objectively the right call. They were ready for it. 3 years of progressively larger contracts had built up to this. They had the staffing, the equipment, the experience, and their food was genuinely some of the best I'd ever featured at a Hartley event. I hadn't told my family it was my event. My dad knew I worked for Hartley Group, obviously, but the scale of what this meant, that I was leading it, that I had designed it, that my career had built to this night, none of that had come up. Partly because I don't talk about my work in terms of milestones when I'm talking to family, and partly because I'd learned a long time ago that telling my mother about my accomplishments before they were complete just created opportunities for her to find them insufficient. I arrived at the hotel at noon for setup. I was wearing my work clothes, dark jeans, a tucked-in blouse, comfortable shoes that I could walk 11 hours in without my feet staging a protest. I had a production binder that was 3 inches thick and color-coded by hour. I had a two-way radio. I was ready. Reeves Catering arrived at 2. I was in the back of house checking the timeline when my mother walked into the kitchen. She stopped when she saw me. For a second, neither of us said anything. "Dana." She looked genuinely surprised. "You're the event manager?" "I'm the lead planner," I said. "This is my event." She looked around the kitchen, at the team she'd brought, at the equipment, at the staging setup I'd had laid out precisely. Then back at me. Something crossed her face. I couldn't quite read it in the moment, though I've thought about it a lot since. Pride, maybe, competing with something older and more habitual. Then she nodded and said, "Well, don't get in the way of the kitchen." I smiled. "I wouldn't dream of it." I went back to my checklist. She went back to hers. And for the next 4 hours, we orbited each other professionally, politely, with the specific careful distance of two people who have decided to be functional rather than honest. Then, an hour before guests arrived, I was standing near the registration table in my dress, navy blue, the one Meredith had told me I should wear for something this big, and she was right. She's always right about things like that, reviewing the evening's run of show with my assistant Claire, when my mother appeared at my elbow. She had Becca with her. Becca, who I hadn't known was coming, who looked as surprised to see me in that context as I was to see her. My sister in her catering uniform, holding a tablet with her event checklist pulled up, blinking at me the way you blink at someone when the image doesn't quite fit the frame. And my mother had a look on her face that I recognized from 32 years of knowing her. The look she wore when she was about to manage a situation. "Dana," she said, lowering her voice to just above a whisper. "Some of the Hartley executives are going to be walking through this lobby in about 10 minutes. "I know," I said. "I planned the arrival sequence." She didn't acknowledge that. She had already moved past it, the way she sometimes moves past things I say before she's really heard them. "These are very important people." "I'm aware." She put her hand on my arm, gently. "The way you steady something you're afraid might tip over. I just want to make sure we all make a good impression tonight." She glanced at my dress, then at the guests beginning to filter into the lobby area ahead of the official opening, then back at my face. "This is a big account for us. For the family business." I understood exactly what she was saying. What she was actually saying. She was saying, "Be careful tonight, Dana. Don't take up too much space. Let the professionals handle it. Let the people who know what they're doing run the room." She was saying, "You're here, and that's fine, but don't complicate things." Then she lifted her hand, not quite pointing at me but in my direction, and she said the words that landed harder than I think she intended them to. "Don't embarrass us." I looked at her for exactly 3 seconds. I counted them the way I always count when I need to stay calm and not say the thing I'm actually thinking. Then I said, "Of course, Mom." I turned back to Claire in the run of show. My mother went back to the kitchen. Becca lingered for just a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between sympathy and uncertainty, and then she followed her. And I stood in the lobby of the hotel that I had spent 3 months preparing, in the dress I had chosen specifically for this night, and I took a breath and I went back to work. 5 minutes later, the first guests arrived. If you've ever been reduced to a liability by the person who is supposed to be your biggest supporter, comment below. And if you're new here, subscribe. Because what happened in that ballroom 5 minutes later is the part I've wanted to tell someone for a long time. The guests began arriving at 6:30. 200 people in formal attire, moving through the lobby and into the ballroom, finding their seats, accepting glasses of wine from staff who moved smoothly and quietly because I had briefed them thoroughly on exactly how I needed the room to feel. Not rushed, not stiff. Warm, without being overly casual. The room looked exactly the way I had envisioned it in my head for 4 months. The lighting was right, warm enough to be flattering, bright enough to see across the table without straining, with the accent lighting on the centerpieces dialed to just the level I'd requested after 3 rounds of back and forth with the venue's AV crew. The table settings were right. The music was at exactly the level where people could hear each other talk, which is the single most underappreciated element of event planning. Music that's either too loud or too quiet ruins the entire mood of a room, and most people don't know that's what's wrong, they just feel it. Everything was right. Meredith Collins had been my mentor at Hartley Group since my 2nd year. She was VP of Operations, sharp and direct and allergic to pretense in a way I deeply appreciated. She was the first person at the company who had seen what I was actually capable of, rather than what I looked like on paper. And she had been vocal about it in rooms I wasn't in, which I only found out later from people who were. She knew about my family's catering business. She knew about the contracts. I hadn't hidden it from her. She was VP of Operations, which meant she saw all vendor contracts, which meant she had seen my name next to Reeves Catering's name 16 times over 3 years. She had never once made it complicated. She had just processed the paperwork, noted the performance reviews, and said, during one of our one-on-one meetings, "Your family's company does really good work." I said, "They do." That was the whole conversation. That was exactly right. The night of the gala, when I told her my mother had told me not to embarrass the family, she laughed once quickly and then got her face back under control. "I see," she said. Then she thought for a moment. "Does she understand what your job is tonight?" I said. "She understands that I'm the event manager. I don't think she understands what that actually means in this context." Around the room I had designed and planned, and that was running exactly the way I'd intended, and she said, "Well, by the end of the night, I imagine she will." She was right. "Beautiful room," she said. "Thank you." She looked at me sideways. She had the particular sideways look of someone who can read me well and knows I'm not entirely okay. "You seem quieter than usual." "My mother told me not to embarrass the family," I said. I kept my voice completely neutral when I said it. Not bitter, just informational. Meredith blinked. Then she looked across the room at the Reeves catering service team, moving with practiced efficiency through the tables, refreshing water, adjusting settings, communicating with the kitchen staff through the earpieces I'd arranged for them. "Shh, back at me. Does she know that?" "No," I said. "She doesn't know most of it." Meredith was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Well, tonight might be an interesting night for her to find out." She squeezed my arm once. The specific squeeze that means I see you and I've got you, and she moved on to go talk to a client. At 7:15, the dinner service began. Courses came out precisely on schedule. The appetizers were beautiful, delicate, seasonal, exactly right for an October evening, and I know they were perfect not just because I had tasted everything during the afternoon walkthrough, but because 3 separate guests stopped a server during cocktail hour to specifically compliment the bruschetta. You don't get 3 compliments on the appetizers unless you're doing something right. The main course hit the tables at 8, timed to the minute, and I watched my father's food being set in front of 200 people who had no idea that the hands that made it were the same hands that had taught me to make cornbread on a rainy Saturday when I was 7 years old. That thought moved through me quickly and I let it go. There was still an hour and a half of program to manage. At 8:40, Paul Hartley stood up at the front of the room. Paul is the kind of person who commands a room just by existing in it, not because of his volume or his energy, but because when he speaks, people understand that he means exactly what he says and not one word more or less. He's been running Hartley Group for 12 years. He still knows every major client's name, their kids' names, what they care about. He's the kind of CEO who makes people feel seen, and in the events world, where everything is about how people feel at the end of the night, that matters more than most things. He thanked the guests. He talked about the company's year, significant growth, 2 major new client acquisitions, a partnership announcement that got genuine applause. He made a few people laugh with a well-timed story about a site visit that went sideways, the self-deprecating kind that CEOs with real confidence can pull off. Standard gala content, and he delivered it well. But then he said something that was not standard. "Before I sit down," he said, his tone shifting slightly from warm professional to warm personal, "I want to take a moment to recognize someone on our team who most of you in this room have interacted with without ever knowing her name." I was looking at my phone, checking the dessert window timing. The mousse needed to come out at 9:10 to be at the right temperature by service. I was focused on the mousse. 4 years ago, Dana Reeves walked into this company as an event coordinator. I looked up. She had a hospitality degree, an impeccable organizational system. and an ability to stay completely calm in situations that would send most people running in the opposite direction. He smiled. I know this because I have seen her stay calm in those situations. More than once. A few people laughed. I was standing very still. Over the past 4 years, Dana has planned or co-planned 47 events for Hartley Group. He looked at a card briefly, though I think he had this memorized. She has maintained a client satisfaction rating across her events of 94%. She has personally brought in 3 major accounts by designing events that those clients specifically said influenced their decision to work with us. And tonight, she planned everything you are experiencing. He gestured broadly at the room, the lighting, the tables, the music, the timing of everything. All of it. From the placement of the centerpieces to the timing of this speech. Dana, will you stand up, please? I looked up from my phone. 200 people turned to find me. I stood up. Slowly. Because my legs were doing something I didn't expect them to do. Which was feel slightly uncertain for a moment. I put my phone in my dress pocket. I stood up straight. I looked at Paul, because it was easier to look at someone specific than at 200 people. Meredith was looking at me from across the room with an expression that I will carry with me for a long time. It was the face of someone who has believed in you for years and is watching that belief be publicly confirmed. It's a specific look. I haven't forgotten it. It is my honor to announce, Paul said, and the room got quieter as he said it, the particular quiet of people understanding that something significant is about to be said. That effective November 1st, Dana Reeves will be moving into the role of Vice President of Events and Client Experience at Hartley Group. He paused. She has earned every letter of that title, and I would argue that everyone in this room who has attended one of our events in the last 4 years has already been experiencing her leadership, even if they didn't know her name. The room applauded. Real applause. The kind that builds on itself, because it's genuine rather than obligatory. I stood there in the back of the ballroom and accepted it with what I hope was grace. Because the truth is, I was mostly holding it together by breathing slowly and focusing on the view out the window and reminding myself that this was not the moment to fall apart. But Paul wasn't done. I also want to acknowledge something a little more personal, he said, and the room settled again, sensing a shift. Hartley Group takes our vendor relationships seriously. We don't choose based on cost alone. We choose based on quality, consistency, and trust. And for the last 3 years, one of the most consistent and trusted vendors for our major dining events has been a family catering company out of Roswell, Georgia, called Reeves Catering. I felt the blood leave my face, not because I was afraid, because I suddenly understood exactly where this was going and I had approximately 5 seconds to prepare for it. What many of you may not know, Paul continued, is that Reeves Catering was introduced to our vendor list by Dana, and what Dana's family may not fully know is the degree to which she has been quietly and deliberately routing our best events their way, not as a favor, not as nepotism, but because they are genuinely excellent, and because they are her family. And she never told them the full picture. She never asked for recognition for it. She just made sure it happened. He looked at something on his card. 3 years. 16 contracts. $283,000 in business sent from Hartley Group to a family catering company that Dana Reeves built quietly and consistently from inside this organization. He looked up. That is loyalty. That is integrity. And that is exactly the kind of person I want leading our events division. He raised his glass. To Dana, 200 people raised their glasses. I looked across the ballroom, past the tables and the guests and the candlelight, toward the kitchen doorway. My mother was standing there. She had come out during the speech to watch, the way catering staff sometimes do when service pauses between courses, just to hear the program for a moment before going back to work. She was holding a white cloth against her side, the service cloth she always carries at events, her standard position, and her face, the face that had pointed at me in a hotel hallway an hour ago and told me not to embarrass the family, was doing something I had never in 32 years seen it do. She couldn't look at me. Not because she was angry. Not because she was dismissive. She was trying to look at me. I could see her trying, her eyes moving in my direction and then sliding away again, down to the floor, back to the cloth, because she was crying. Actually crying. The kind where you lose control of it a little, where your face does the thing your face does before you can stop it. My dad stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder. He was looking directly at me. His face was open in a way that a 60-year-old man's face is rarely open in a room full of 200 people. Proud. Settled. The face of a person seeing something confirmed that he has always believed was true. Becca stood to their left, and she was looking at me with an expression that I watched change in real time, like something being revised, like a sentence being rewritten in front of you. I stayed standing until the applause ran its course. Then I sat back down. Meredith appeared beside me 30 seconds later. She didn't say anything, she just sat there with me, which was the right thing, and after about a minute I was steady enough to pull out my phone and check the dessert timeline. The mousse came out at 9 to 10. Exactly on schedule. Because that's the job. And the job continues even when your entire world just shifted. If you've ever done something quietly for people who didn't know you were doing it, drop a comment. I want to know you're out there. And subscribe, because the part that actually changed things came after the applause stopped, not during it. My mother found me near the dessert station about 30 minutes later. The dinner was winding down. Guests were moving around, talking, the easy social hours at the end of a long event when everything is done and everyone is relaxed. She came up beside me and stood there for a moment without saying anything. I kept my eyes on the room. "Dana." Her voice was different than it had been in the hallway before the guests arrived. Not smaller, exactly, but slower, more deliberate, like she was choosing her words rather than just saying the ones that came first. "Mom." I looked at her. She was holding her hands together in front of her, the way she holds them when she doesn't know what to do with them. She looked older in that light than I usually thought of her as looking, and I noticed for the first time in a while that she was tired. Not just tonight tired. The kind of tired that comes from a long time of being certain about things, and then finding out you were certain about the wrong things. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't." She looked toward the ballroom, where guests were still talking, where the evening my father's cooking had made possible was still unfolding. "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about that for a moment. The real answer was complicated, but the true version of it wasn't. "Because I knew you'd make it difficult," I said. "And I didn't want it to be difficult. I just wanted it to happen." She was quiet. "The business was struggling 3 years ago," I said. "Not critically, but tight. I could see it in the way Dad talked about the equipment. In the way you two stopped talking about expansion. I could help without making it a whole conversation, so I helped. We would have argued with you," she said. "I know." She looked at her hands. "Because we're stupid. Because you would have thought I was offering charity," I said. "I wasn't. I was hiring the best caterer I knew. That just happened to be family." She was quiet for a long time, then she said, quietly, "I told you not to embarrass us. You did. Tonight." Her voice dropped lower. "I said that to you tonight. You did." She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet. "Dana, Mom." I kept my voice steady, not cold, just steady. "It's okay, you didn't know. That's not an excuse." "No," I said, "it's not. But it is the truth." She pressed her lips together. She was trying to hold something in, and it wasn't working. "I have been so unfair to you," she said. "For so long. I thought Becca showing up meant you weren't. I thought because you left for Atlanta that you'd left for good. I never." She stopped. Started again. "I never thought to ask what you were doing when you weren't here. I assumed the wrong thing, for years." I looked at her. My mother, 60 years old, standing in a hotel hallway in her catering uniform, finally saying something true to me at the end of a night that had rearranged every wrong assumption she'd been carrying. There are moments in family relationships where you can feel something shifting, where you can feel the ground of a thing finally moving after years of it being frozen solid. This was one of those moments. "I know you love me," I said. "You've always loved me. You just also thought I wasn't showing up. And I wasn't showing up in the ways you could see, but I was showing up in the ways I could." She nodded. She wiped her eyes quickly, the way she does, not wanting anyone to catch her at it. "I'm proud of you," she said. And this time, with no bleachers between us, no graduation ceremony, no performance of it for an aunt or a cousin, this time it was just her voice and my name and 32 years of something finally landing where it was supposed to go. I should have said that more. I should have said it out loud where you could actually hear it. I hugged her. Not the careful hug we'd been doing for years, the polite one, the one that counts the seconds until it ends, a real one. The kind that's a little too long and a little too tight and says something neither of us had the words for. My dad appeared at the end of the hall. He looked at us for a moment, and then he walked over and put his arms around both of us without saying a word, because that's exactly the kind of man my father is. Becca found us a few minutes later. She stood there looking at me with the expression I'd seen earlier, the rearranging one, and she said simply, "I had no idea you were doing all of this." I said, "I know. I didn't want you to feel like I was trying to swoop in." She shook her head. "You were keeping the lights on." I said, "The food keeps the lights on. I just sent people to the food." She laughed a little. Then she hugged me too. And it was the first real hug we'd had in probably 4 years, and it felt like the beginning of something that should have started a long time ago. My dad appeared from the kitchen a few minutes later, still in his apron. He looked at all three of us standing together in a hotel hallway, and he made the specific face that men of his generation make when they're trying not to show that something has moved them. Then he put one arm around my mother and rested his other hand on my shoulder for a moment, briefly, before he went back to the kitchen. He had work to finish. He always has work to finish. That was enough. More than enough. We stood there for another few minutes, the three of us, just talking. Nothing important. Becca mentioned a chicken dish she'd been trying to get right for the fall menu. My mother asked if I'd eaten anything tonight, which is a mother thing to say, and I said I'd had an appetizer at 4:30 and was planning to eat something real after I finished breakdown. My mother looked like she was going to say something about that, and then she didn't, and I appreciated that small restraint more than I could have explained. The gala ended at 10:30. I stayed until 11 helping my team break down. The Reeves catering crew was still working when I walked through the kitchen for the last time, my heels in my hand, my checklist complete. I had been on my feet for 11 hours. Everything ached. Everything was also, in the specific way that hard work at the end of a good night feels, completely fine. My dad was at the sink. He heard me come in and turned around. He looked at me for a long moment. He had known for almost a year what I'd been doing. He had watched it happen and kept the secret and trusted me to let it land when it was ready to land. He didn't say anything grand. He just nodded. The specific nod, the one he'd been giving me since I was a kid when I'd done something right. The nod that meant "I see you," and then he turned back to the sink. That was enough, more than enough. I drove home with the windows down in the October cold, because I needed the air and I didn't care that it was too cold for open windows. I cried most of the way home. Not the sad kind, the release kind. The kind that comes when something you've been holding carefully for a long time finally gets to put itself down, and you realize how long you were holding it. The weeks after the gala were different. Not perfect. One evening doesn't fix 32 years of accumulated assumptions. But different. My mother started calling me on Sundays, short calls at first. Practical things, how's work, how's the apartment? Did you hear about the new place they're opening in Buckhead? But they got longer over time, and they started becoming about real things. She started asking me questions and actually waiting for the answers instead of moving to the next point while I was still talking. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. She also apologized. Not the qualified kind, not the "if I made you feel" kind. A real one. She called me on a Sunday in November, said she'd been thinking about things, and then said plainly and directly that she had been unfair to me for a long time, that she had valued Becca's choice to stay more than my choice to go, without ever asking herself what showing up actually looked like when you didn't live 12 minutes away, and that she was sorry. She said the apology mattered to her whether or not I needed to hear it because she needed to say it. I cried. She may have cried too, though she'd deny it. I told her it meant a lot. It did. My dad called me separately the week after the gala. He told me he had figured out what I was doing about 8 months into it, when the volume and type of events kept matching what he knew about Hartley Group's event calendar. He said he hadn't told my mother because he knew she would have found a way to make it complicated, and he wanted to let it keep going as long as it could. She needed to see it to believe it, he said. That's just how she's built. If I'd told her you were sending us work, she would have spent 6 months arguing about whether it was charity. He paused. I'm sorry I didn't push her sooner. I told him he'd done exactly the right thing. I meant it. Becca and I started texting regularly, which we hadn't done in years. She sent me photos of dishes she was developing for the spring menu. I sent her things I was seeing at venues, presentation ideas, table concepts, things that might work for the catering side. We had a real conversation about the business for the first time in years. And somewhere in that conversation, she said something I'll hold on to for a while. She said, "I think I always felt like you left because you didn't want to be part of what we were building. I didn't think about you building something of your own that was also about us." I said, "Yeah, that's pretty much what happened." She said, "I should have asked." Paul gave me the VP title on November 1st, as promised. My first formal act in the role was to bring a 3-year vendor contract for Reeves Catering to the legal team and get it signed and filed properly. Not a favor, a contract. Official, renewable, documented. When the paperwork arrived at the Roswell kitchen, my mother called me. She said, "Your name is on this contract." I said, "I know, it's been on a lot of them." She laughed. I want to hold on to that laugh for a long time. I kept that with me through the breakdown, through the drive home, through the whole November that followed. It's a strange thing to finally be seen by the people who should have seen you all along. It doesn't feel the way you expect it to, when you've been imagining it for a long time. It doesn't feel triumphant. It feels more like relief. Like when you put down a bag you've been carrying so long, you forgot you were carrying it. Your shoulders are lighter. You have to consciously notice that they're lighter, and then you adjust to what it feels like to walk around without the weight. My mother called me the Sunday after the gala. Short call. She asked how I was feeling after such a long night. I said I was good. She said she was glad. We talked for about 12 minutes about nothing in particular. A neighbor's renovation project, the weather, whether I'd tried the new restaurant that opened near my building. And at the end, before we hung up, she said, "Good work this week, Dana. Just that. Clean and plain." I said, "Thank you. I meant it." That is the thing about being seen when you finally are. It doesn't come with fireworks. It just comes with small, ordinary moments where someone speaks to you like you count. And sometimes that's exactly enough. The woman who told me not to embarrass her that night was not a villain. She was not a bad mother. She was a person who had made up her mind about what the story was, who showed up and who didn't, who sacrificed and who ran. And she had carried that story for years without anyone giving her a reason to update it. She believed what she believed because the evidence she had access to pointed in that direction. She just didn't know about all the evidence. Most misunderstandings between people aren't about dishonesty. They're about incomplete information and the stories we build to fill in the gaps. Someone sees part of what you're doing, draws a conclusion, and if nobody corrects it, that conclusion becomes the whole story. And those stories, once they're set, are remarkably hard to move, until the night 200 people and a 3-star ballroom announcement make them impossible to ignore. I could have told her years ago. I chose not to, partly because I knew the conversation it would start, and partly because I genuinely didn't need the credit. But I also think I didn't tell her because I needed her to find out in a room she couldn't argue with. I needed 200 people and a CEO and a formal announcement and 3 years of documented contracts. I needed the whole ballroom to be the witness, because the ballroom couldn't be dismissed. She understood. She couldn't look at me in the moment, which told me more than words would have anyway. And then she found me at the dessert station and said the things she should have said a long time ago, and I accepted them, and we're not where we used to be anymore. That's enough. That's more than I expected, honestly. Because when I first drove away from that house in Roswell at 18 with a scholarship and a suitcase and an idea of what I wanted my life to look like, I genuinely didn't know if my family would ever understand what I was building or why. I just decided to build it anyway. And my dad's new refrigeration unit is still running perfectly. He sent me a photo of it last week with the caption, "Year 1, still going." I have it saved on my phone. If you've ever been the quiet one, the one working in the background, the one sending contracts nobody knows about, the one showing up in ways nobody can see yet, comment the biggest clients so I know you're out there. I want to know. And if this story made you think about one person in your life who maybe doesn't know everything you've been doing for them, maybe this week is the right time to let them find out. You don't have to wait for a ballroom. Sometimes you can just pick up the phone. Subscribe to Twist of Revenge. More stories are coming. Stories about people who worked quietly and waited patiently and then watched the room understand what they'd been doing the whole time. And I'll see you in the next one.